Hey, welcome to the Science of Parenting podcast, where we connect you with research-based information that fits your family. We'll talk about the realities of being a parent and how research can help guide our parenting decisions. I'm Mackenzie Johnson, parent of two littles with their own quirks, and I'm a parenting educator.
And I'm Lori Haynes, parent of three in three life stages, launched in college and in high school, and I am a parenting educator. And we have officially launched season 3. Here we are. And this entire season, we are talking about temperament and how it impacts your parenting.
Yes.
And just a quick reminder about temperament and what it is and what it isn't before we start. So, temperament is our predisposition to how we react. It's inborn, it's genetic, it's with us from the very beginning of life. And it's essentially our behavior that goes way, way back. How is it different from personality, you might be wondering? Well, temperament is that foundation. And then personality builds on top of temperament. So, personality emerges as we grow, as we encounter others in our environment, our life experiences. But temperament, it's kind of always been there from the beginning.
Yes, I love that word foundation. After we clung to it, I think that was in our first episode of season 3. I'm still hanging on to it.
Yeah, it is our foundation.
So this week kicks off our third trait and kind of our deep dive into the third of 9 different temperament traits. And I remember how we talked about that temperament research is based off of Thomas and Chess, as well as Jim Cameron and his colleagues at Kaiser Permanente, and them tracking thousands of kids' temperament traits over 30 plus years. And what they gathered was this idea that all of us have these 9 same traits. It's just a matter of figuring out how much of them we got. So did we get a lot or did we get a little? And if you need a quick refresher on those traits and a little more information on them and where you can find about your child's temperament, you can check that out on our website, scienceofparenting.org, for those temperament resources. But for now, let's get started talking about persistence. I won't say this one is my favorite one because I know I might say that every week if I'm not careful, but I really like this one too.
Yes, and as we think about persistence and a definition, I mean, do we really need a definition? Can't we
you hear this word and
right? We can all see someone in our head right now, and it might actually be us we see in our head when the word persistence flashes up on the screen, right?
Yeah.
So the temperament philosophy theory educators that we are basing our temperament series on are Stella Chess and Alexander Thomas. And they define persistence as that ability to stop doing something when asked instead of fighting to continue. So Jim Cameron and his work at Kaiser Permanente, they talked a lot about it in terms of what is our frustration. So how tolerant are we to being frustrated, to ask, being stopped to do something? And so as we talk about this today, that's what I want you to think of in terms of persistence. Being told to stop doing something, and how frustrated does that make you?
No, thanks. Don't ask me to stop. No, thanks.
I love that. And as we look through our parenting resources and the temperament gurus that we'll be talking about, I love what Mary Sheedy Krasinka says in her book, Raising Your Spirited Child. And she explains that this trait in particular is a key trait when it comes to understanding that parent-child power struggle.
Power struggle. Yes. And I've actually been listening to the book on an audio book. And so I've been listening to that. And Mary Sheedy Krasinka really does encourage us to kind of reframe how we look at certain behaviors from our perspective. And maybe behaviors we might consider like annoying or difficult or bothersome. And to look at those characteristics instead from a strength-based perspective. So we want to remove that negative label of how we're talking about it. And just removing the label and how we think about it can actually reduce the struggle, right? Instead of thinking my child is being difficult, thinking this is really important to them. right? That can
Mhm.
change the power struggle. And so,
Mhm.
how we tend to talk about all these traits and persistence in particular is important. So, I think she also talks about this idea that labels are contagious, that how
Mm.
we talk about our kids can frame how other people will think about them. She has this example about talking with your child's teacher. And yeah, if we say, yeah, they're stubborn, or if we say, yeah, that's really important to her, isn't it? And so how we reframe it. So can we talk a little bit more about those labels, particularly related to persistence? Because I think this one sometimes gets a bad rap. Like whether you're highly persistent or low, I feel like it kind of gets a bad name sometimes.
I
What are
I
some of the terms
definitely
you
would
think of?
agree. I would agree. And I think that so let's play a little word game. How about
Uh,
this?
All right.
I'll say a negative word and let's see if you
Mhm.
can try to reframe it. How's
Ooh.
that sound?
Ooh, okay. This is a game, isn't it? Kind of a
Okay.
quiz.
So, stubborn.
Persistent. That's the trait, right? Persistent.
Yep. Um, how about lazy? If someone is not
Ooh.
persistent.
I would say accepting. Like they might
Accepting.
be willing to accept that outcome easier than maybe someone who's more highly persistent.
Ooh, I love that. How about, so let's go with another high persistent word. Demanding.
Tenacious.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
Yes, tenacious.
Getting
Okay,
after it.
less persistent word.
Mhm.
Unmotivated. Like
Hmm.
why don't they just finish a task?
Mm. I might say able to let it go. Like
Excellent.
they're
Yes.
like, yeah, this isn't a thing that is I absolutely have to do. I could let that go.
I can let that go. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I love those. Okay, thanks.
And those words really matter, right? The way that we talk about our kids and whether we're using some of those more positive words or some of those maybe words that don't have as positive of a connotation, it matters in how we talk about them. And honestly, it can change how we think about them, right? The
Mm.
way that I view what they're doing and how they approach things. But that can honestly change too, depending on like the age and the situation, right?
Exactly. Exactly. So, an infant, for instance, that's high and persistent, it may help them learn to walk or crawl or drink from a cup sooner. And we might think, great. And
Mm.
then, as a preschooler with high persistence, it just might make us feel like we have to pull our hair out when they won't let us help them put their shoes on. Right? They're insistent they are going to put their shoes on.
So as
On
an
the
infant, that trait feels like, yes, this is helping them do what I want. But
exactly.
in preschool, that same trait is suddenly like, this is making my life difficult.
True.
So is that
True.
on the other end too, right?
Absolutely. A less persistent child, we may have a hard time when we as a parent think they're not meeting those milestones.
Mm.
Oh gosh, think about all of the parents are saying, "How old is your child? Oh, do they walk yet?
And you're like,
Oh,
no,
how old is your child? Are they riding a bike yet?
no.
How old is your child? Oh, did they get their school permit?
Mm.
No."
That wasn't
And
high on their list.
right, that's exactly it. Persistence, it wasn't high on their list. And that's okay. And
Yes.
so we as parents have to recognize that, some of these developmental milestones are tied into temperament. And rather than shaming ourselves or letting others shame us, we just have to recognize that all children are unique. They all have
Mm.
gifts that are different from other children.
Yes.
Oof.
And the way we understand them and value them can vary in different situations. You know, you use those terms assets and liabilities. That same trait might be an asset here and a liability here. You know, the way that might be the way we view it. But I feel like we're kind of
Absolutely.
tiptoeing into our next tidbit, which is kind of about this continuum. Will you tell us more about that?
Yes. So now that we know what persistence is,
Mhm.
then remember we've been looking at temperament traits based on this continuum of how much did they get? Okay, we all get part of this trait. Did we get a
Mhm.
little bit or did we get a lot? And so let's look again at Mary's book on when we think about persistence. And so talking about the child who has a high amount of persistence, meaning they get very frustrated when someone tells them no. Okay. When they are asked to switch tasks, they may not tolerate those interruptions easily and they want to finish what they're doing. They may get stuck or locked in until they solve a problem. And I mean, in fact, actually, they can be very goal oriented. So, did you see me just flip that label?
Yeah.
And when you think about it, it's highly probable that inventors that you think
Yes.
about, like maybe Alexander Graham Bell or George Washington Carver, I mean, they might have been highly persistent to create their new inventions.
Yes.
And honestly, highly persistent children are not a fan of limits.
Yes. And I am highly persistent. I feel like I've maybe heard that before. So I can relate to that. Like, yeah, don't tell me I can't, or don't tell me, right?
Mhm.
Those are not things that I like and that I maybe would naturally positively respond to. So when we think about our kids, right? So thinking about that high end of the continuum, when they're persistent with a task, maybe that's an opportunity, right? We flipped our positive label, like this is something that's really important to them, or they're really
Mhm.
tenacious, or man, they are just really working hard, want to see it to the finish. Traits that, yeah, when we think about those inventors, we see positively. And then when we think about challenging moments, we may think of persistence with a different filter.
Exactly.
But we know that kids are learning, their independence and their autonomy, and persistence is really a place we're going to see that play out. And so sometimes it's a challenge for us as parents to accept that persistence, especially like if maybe you feel like you're in a hurry. You're like, I don't have time for you to struggle with this right now. Just let me help you. And so that high persistence can be a challenge, but it really is, right? That it can be a positive trait in adulthood and something we value there.
Oh, 100%, 100%. And when you think about, it being a power struggle between the adult and the child, why is that a power struggle? Because of the limit placed on whatever action it is. And so
Right. We don't have enough time. My limit is we don't have enough time for this. Or, that might be an example. But okay, so that might be the highly persistent end. What about on our, maybe if you have a little of the trait? So if you're less
Okay.
persistent or your child is.
Sure. So if we move to the other end of the continuum and consider that, a less persistent temperament might be less frustrated when it comes to limit setting. They may be more patient with limits, and it actually might be more okay to interrupt them. And so if we think about infants and toddlers, they may be more easily redirected, for instance.
Or the child that when you say, all right, time for dinner, it might be easier for them to walk away from the thing they're working on, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so all right, we're talking about infants and toddlers. Let's walk all the way through. I like when we do this, when you kind of break down at the different ages. So kind of a developmental task from infancy through examples with teens, how we might see this trait play out with a common thing. So let's go with that infant and toddler. You said they might be more easily redirectable if they're on the low end. What might be kind of a thing you might see play out with persistence in like infant and toddlerhood?
So think about what's their kind of goal? What are they really focusing right then and there in their world? And essentially what infants and toddlers are doing, and let's just look at the infants for a little bit here. So, like 0 to 18 months or so, their whole being, honestly, is about exploring their world. So the persistent child exploring their world, what do they look like? And I envision, my infant sitting in her high chair and there being just enough milk on the high chair, and she's old enough to be eating Cheerios, and the persistent infant she's trying to catch that Cheerio with her tiny little pincer grab, hunting it down, right? And she's maybe getting more and more frustrated because that Cheerio keeps slipping through that milk, right? Where the less persistent child, the infant, they're exploring their world. The less persistent child, they're easily distracted. So as they're crawling over toward the light socket, you might just be able to literally pick them up and turn them around the other way. Well, they're going to go explore something different. Yes.
Oh, that's an example right now in our house in infancy. Like, how easy is it to redirect you from the stairs? Right now we're climbing stairs with my littlest. And how easy is it to redirect you from that? Like,
Yes.
yes.
And
Okay.
so then let's think about the toddler. So the toddler
Yeah.
is a child up to the age of 3. What are they doing in their life? They're really working on becoming more independent.
Mhm.
And, I envision the child who's pulling up their zipper, of their coat.
Mhm.
And the persistent child is going to just keep focusing on that coat. There could be there could be many things happening around them, but right now they are so focused on getting that zipper up on their coat. And like
Mm.
you said, we're in a hurry, we got to go.
Yes.
So our
Get
reaction
out
might
the
be,
door.
get out the door, let me just zip the coat, right? And so the less persistent child, they might be more willing to accept help.
Mhm.
And so how do we help that persistent child move on when we recognize developmentally their little fingers can't quite get that zipper started?
Yeah.
Okay, one little tip I want to give right here, just because I can, is the most important phrase you can do is let me start it. So you start the zipper
Ooh.
and the persistent child finishes it. Okay.
He
Just let
sneaks.
me
There's
let
that
me
experience.
start it. Let me start it. Yes, you get to zip the zipper. There it goes. All right. So we're right. So
Mildly
the
distracted, but on point. So what
yes.
about if we keep moving up? So moving on to maybe like our school age kids.
Okay, so our school-aged children, they're working on mastering difficult tasks. They're mastering responsibility, not mastering, they're working on developing responsibility, and they're increasing their independence. And so as you think about the more persistent child, you might look at them, let's say they're fixing their bicycle and they just are going to get this fixed. They're going to get it fixed, but you're saying it's time for us to eat dinner. It's time for us to go, whatever. You just set a limit on their ability to finish that fixing of the bicycle. And so that bicycle is increasing their independence. And so being frustrated with that might be really, really important as far as developmentally for them to finish. The
On
less
the low end of that, yeah.
the less persistent elementary school age, again, increasing their independence, but they might say, well, it's okay, I can finish this later. It might just be not that important for them to finish it right this minute.
Or maybe they never get back to it. Yeah, right? Like if it's low persistence, like maybe don't get back around to it for quite a while.
Not sure.
They're able to kind of accept, like, okay, I didn't get this done. I'll catch it later.
Exactly.
They're accepting.
And I think that if we move up the age continuum, we can also say that the middle school, preteen, teenager, they're experiencing with different values. They might be experimenting with their friends' values versus their family's values, and they're beginning to establish their own identity. And so what does that look like? Well, they might make different choices than you. And how does their persistence, a highly persistent child, is all about their choice.
Yeah.
And the less persistent child, they might not argue with you about other choices, their friends' choices. And so, temperament plays a huge piece in those developmental milestones.
Absolutely. We see that play out and across the gamut there, like all the way through. Persistence is there. And yeah, not negative, not positive, not good or bad. Just it's there.
It's there.
And this is their temperament, and we're not changing it. We're figuring it out.
We are.
So I was like, so thinking about your temperament or my temperament or our kids' temperament, where does your family kind of land?
Persistent trait. So I am more persistent than I am less persistent. I would say that I'm not quite as persistent as you. And I would say that of my 3 children, 2 of them are less persistent than me. And one of them, actually, I don't know that any of them is more persistent than me, but they each have their own level of persistence, and they're all 3 less persistent than me, I would say.
Okay. All right. Well, in my family, I do have the highest persistence. My co-parent is still persistent, but kind of in like the milder range. I'm on the more extreme range of persistent. And then actually both of my kids are kind of right in that kind of variable middle. They could maybe go either way.
Mhm.
So that's interesting, that we're both kind of the extreme in our case. So that is
Yeah.
interesting.
Yes, I think that, and I think that for okay, so I'm not going to tell this story. I'm going to save this story, but that essentially brings us right into our next research topic, which is that goodness of fit. Okay,
Hmm.
so I'm going to save my goodness of fit story for next. But remember, we talked about that idea of learning to respond to the child's
Mhm.
natural temperament, and that's what Stella Chess and Alexander Thomas call goodness of fit. So essentially what we're doing is we're learning to understand our child's natural tendencies. And when we do that, it actually helps us to not blame them or even ourselves. So it
Mhm.
honestly helps bring out the best in both of us. And ultimately, it might make our job easier as a parent. And I don't know about you, but I'm all about making my
I'll take
parenting
it.
job easier. Okay. And the reason for that is because it can actually help us prevent behavior problems. So look at your persistence,
Hmm.
look at your children, and as you look across them, you might not be surprised at times when some are similar to yours, because remember, it is genetic.
Yes.
And you might not be surprised if they're different. So as you look across, there are times where you may have clashed with your child's temperament when it comes to persistence.
I think I might say that my own high persistence sometimes gets me like that I'm creating a power struggle, maybe is the word I want with my kids, because like no, 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 like unwavering in that commitment to whatever it is. And so that maybe I'm apt to do that. But there's actually an example when I think about goodness of fit and how we match mismatch with my significant other that we um he had come home for lunch and I was here and I was working on something and he was like, "Oh, are you gonna like come eat lunch?" And I was like, "Yeah, like okay, I need 10 minutes. Okay, 10-ish minutes." And I'm working on it, working on it. And then it's like 30 minutes later, he's like, "Okay, like I thought it was gonna be about 10 minutes." I was like, "Okay, I'm like, I'll finish this part." And long story short, about it was like 3 hours later, and I still hadn't eaten lunch because I was working on like I needed to do what I was doing. And it's a good thing that he didn't wait for me to eat
Oh,
lunch. But I was committed to what I was doing. And so our persistence sometimes, he's a little, like mild, but less than me. And so understanding how those fit together and how those might impact what our behavior patterns might be and our understanding of each other. Like, okay, he may be more understanding that like this is just who Mackenzie is and that she's gotta finish what she's doing. So
exactly. And I'd
and that can be the
love
case
that.
with our kids.
Yeah, I love that you said it, but it might be actually me that,
Yeah.
creates the power struggle.
Mhm.
Because honestly, it's about that persistence, that higher persistence can actually maybe ignite the power
Mm.
struggle between you and the child, regardless of who's got the intense temperament.
Mm.
It's that persistence piece that ignites it. And remember that no trait has a good or is good or bad in and of itself. It's that, is it a gift? Where can we find its gifts? Learning to understand how it works alongside our child is what becomes a central focus. And the story I was going to share is that, sometimes with my higher persistence trait than my children's, I can sometimes feel myself maybe judging. Why don't they take this, in my eyes, as
Mhm.
seriously? Why don't they want to finish this task as much as I want them to finish this task? And it's almost me in my head having this shaming of my child's lack of
Mm.
desire to finish the task, and
Mm.
that is in no way, shape, or form what I mean. And
Yes.
I think about that level of persistence. And when we talk about flipping the labels, I often will also say about my middle child how she is able to just let things go.
Mhm.
That's
I've
part
heard you say that.
of her persistence. And I think, oh, if only I could at times be like her in terms of just letting it go. And so,
Mhm.
so there is that piece where, yes, it is the power struggle between the parent and the child, but which way is it?
Yes. Well, and Mackenzie, our producer, talked, she was talking about how she has kind of a low persistence as we were getting ready for this episode. And that sometimes she can perceive people as high persistence as like, just get over it, right? Just let it go. So there's challenges and assets and liabilities on both ends. And so as we think about our kids and where they land in this mix of a little or a lot of their persistence and how we perceive those behaviors and how we accept how that affects them working towards independence. We know at a lot of ages that work towards independence and autonomy can be challenging in itself, and persistence is going to play out in how that develops. So maybe that child who isn't putting something away, it's because they are passionate and zealous and committed. And maybe that child that it's maybe easier to let go of, or they don't want to push through on that tough assignment. We can recognize that, like, what, they recognize that they could use a break. And so those are good things in our kids.
Many times in my past work with temperament, I've had parents say that the homework battles are a huge power struggle. And in terms of persistence, especially if the parent has more persistence than the child, the parent is saying, well, just finish it. You only have 3 problems. Why is it taking you, 3 hours? It's only 3 problems. Mm-hmm. And the less persistent child is saying, can I just do 1 and take a break? And then can I come back and do another and take a break? And being able to see from their perspective of being less persistent. I mean, as the adult, we're going, well, yeah, but, and I go, yeah, but it's going to take you 3 hours of fighting and power struggling, or it can take you 3 hours with breaks in between of some great conversations, some time together doing whatever, instead of arguing for 3 hours about homework.
Okay, and that example is like, I'm so ready to tell you the next part. So like in your reality section, of our podcast, kind of towards the end here, we like to talk about some strategies. So we've heard all of this information about persistence, understand what it is, how it looks different on kind of the extreme ends of the spectrum here, or the continuum, and then learned about that goodness of fit. So understanding our temperament and how it maybe works, and gives us challenges and opportunities with our child. And so the thing I want to say as a strategy, so in this 3rd season, we kind of have been tossing back and forth on this your reality. Like, you have some ideas and I've got some ideas, but you talking about this 3-hour homework struggle, and it could look like this or it could look like this. The thing that I hear different is accepting your child's temperament. Accepting if their persistence is low, yes, maybe you worry like, oh, can they do the tough things that they're going to need to do? Or if their persistence is high, are we going to survive, this day with another meltdown over this because of the limit that I set. But instead of saying like, why can't this be different? Understanding like, this is their persistence level, and there's going to be times when we love that and times when that's hard, but accepting that it's not them choosing to be difficult, like they're not being mean to you, or it's just
they're not defying you by not finishing 3 problems right this minute.
Yes.
It is the difference between their persistence and yours. And it's hard. It is hard.
Yes.
Because as the adults, we can see visually the time difference, and we are, taking all.
Doesn't have to take you 3 hours.
But it can. A child, it's a child who is not ready to, move onto that task. Gosh, yes. Anyway, okay. So strategy.
So the strategy, the first one I want to talk about is accepting. Accepting the temperament as it is. What strategy do you want to toss out?
Okay, so Mary Sheedy Krasinska has a great strategy, and it's called finding the yes. And essentially, think of it this way. So when someone sets a limit on you, what are they telling you?
No.
Don't
tell me no.
No. And what does it?
Don't tell me no.
Like you or I, who hears that word no, what is it in our brain?
I'll find a way.
No, I'll find a way. I dare, you've heard me say, I dare someone to tell me no, right? And so Mary says we have to find a way to get a yes. And a yes can be as simple as, yes, I understand that you want to zip up the zipper. Let me start this for you, and you can zip up the zipper.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of saying, no, it's taking too long, I will zip up the zipper.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I know you want to go outside and play. We need to get the homework finished. So, can we negotiate how to finish this?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of, no, you're not leaving this table until your homework is finished.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a difference in how that sounds, and none of that is a way of saying you as the parent is not in control. It's not really about control. It's honestly about relationship and building positive relationships and negotiating responsibility and respect, right? So I'm going to respect the child's temperament, and we're going to negotiate how to work towards the gifts of their temperament.
Yes. And I think the other thing about finding that yes is I think sometimes depending on which end, are we wanting the child? Is the problem that what they want is not what we want? Maybe we want them to do something and their high persistence is like, no thanks. Or their low persistence is like, no thanks. Yeah. But if we want them to do something versus if we want them to stop doing something and finding a way to find a yes, whichever direction it is.
Exactly.
Like you cannot, I'm trying to think of like an older kid example. So
an example for an older child might be you cannot not turn in your homework.
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Or a persistent child, you cannot go out tonight with these particular friends.
Mm-hmm. But we can, right? The yes comes. Mm-hmm. We can spend time with these friends, but we can't go there, right? Yes, correct. You can spend time with your friends, or you can't not turn in your homework, but you can take a break. Yes,
exactly.
You can take a break.
You can take a break. Yes. Yes, you can spend time with those particular friends right here in our own house. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that makes me think of the Trello example from season 1. I was like, yes, you can bring Trello in, but is it going to be this Trello or this Trello? Which one is it? Mm-hmm. Finding a way to make that yes.
And we're still holding the appropriate expectations of our kids, right? We're not saying, yes, do whatever you want. Like,
exactly.
We're still holding appropriate expectations. And yes, we can still meet you where you're at. Because I think that's the other part of accepting their temperament, finding that way to say yes, because we acknowledge, like, okay, I've accepted your temperament. I acknowledge this might be what you need. Even if it's not maybe what I would need. I acknowledge that this is what you need. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And along with that acceptance just comes that understanding. Like the child hears that you understand them and you're willing to listen to what they have to say, whether they're less persistent or highly persistent. You're listening to what they have to say.
Yes. Awesome. So we're finding yeses, we're accepting, we're understanding, we're acknowledging. And I think the other A word, if we're going to throw another one in there, we're kind of anticipating, right? Temperament's that pattern of behavior. So we've got some great strategies on how we can navigate persistence here.
We do.
Okay, awesome. So now that kind of brings us to our Stop Brief Talk section where we bring in our producer, Mackenzie DeYoung, and she tries to stump us with a question. So Lori and I practice using our favorite parenting technique where we stop, recognize what's going on, take a breath, and then speak with intention. So we're going to practice that in our Stop Brief Talk section with Mackenzie DeYoung.
Hello. How's it going?
Oh, we're good. If you ask how it's going before you ask us a question, I'm like, I don't know how it is yet.
What's going to happen here? It's all good. So I have to tell you again that you guys are so good. And I don't know if it's a matter of us as a team or we just kind of are all in the same wavelength. But you already kind of talked about what my first question was going to be. Luckily,
we thieved it.
We have Barb Dunn Swanson on call because she is saving the day. This is something as we were preparing, we talked about, but you guys didn't really touch on as much during the podcast. So I wanted to bring it up. It is relating to a topic that we've talked about I believe in season 2 on that shaming and blaming game, right? That parent shame and feeling that shame from others. So, can you guys talk a little bit about how we handle when others are, or when we're feeling shame or feeling blamed for the way our child's behaving, when it really is just that persistent temperament trait? Either they're being very persistent. Why is your kid not listening? Wow, he just won't give up, come on. Or on that low end of a less persistent kid, why are they not developmentally on par? Why are they not as developed? Why is your kid not walking when my kid is walking? So do you want to talk just a little bit about navigating that situation?
Yes. Can I go first?
You may.
Okay, so I want to go back to the Raising Your Spirited Child book by Mary Sheedy Krasinka, because as I've been listening to it, this it's not a new idea, but saying it this way kind of blew my mind. Of the labels are contagious. The way we talk about our kids and the way other people talk about our kids. And so one of the other researchers we talked with, Rob Copeland, about shyness, he talked about, instead of saying with our shy kid or with our persistent kid, instead of saying they're difficult to somebody else, we would talk about, that's really important to them, or yeah, they're tenacious, right? They're getting after it. And he talked about it in terms of, what they might need. So a shy child might need a little more time, instead of saying they're shy. So I might say, well, a persistent child, they need to find a way to tackle things themselves, right? They need to find a way to tackle things. Or for a low persistent child, well, you really need to push her more, right? That might be what the shaming sounds like. You really need to. And I'm like, you know what? My child is a child that could use a little more time.
Sure.
And I'm going to encourage that. I'm going to encourage her. And so I think those labels of how we talk about it can change a little bit of that shame, of owning, no, I don't need to be ashamed of this. This is my child's temperament.
Without being
I'm proud of myself.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
I'm proud of myself for knowing that.
Right. And I think that some of that is, there's lots of conversations that are had about this, but changing the words you're using, rather than being like, don't attack my kid,
Yes.
And a more, a better, using better communication to get that across, of in that moment of saying, yeah, he's really persistent. Taking forever to get his code zipped. Yeah, he's really persistent. He really likes to figure it out himself, rather than being like, yo, don't attack my kid, which I don't know if I came from how I said that, but really that you get, instead of getting defensive, rather just helping to change that conversation.
Yeah.
Sorry, Lori.
No, I love this. And I love talking about temperament. How long it's been on my mind to share this. But we've been talking to a variety of different veterans in the field of temperament, researchers. And one of them in particular said, there's this whole, and I believe that we talked about this last week, there's this whole mess of parenting books, correct? And this whole mess of parenting books is for, the average normal population within the certain realm. You know what I mean? And then we have these extremes on opposite ends of these temperament continuums. And that piece of parenting toolbook might work for a majority of people reading the book. But for this extreme on each end of the continuum, we have to tweak that parenting tool. And it's the same thing with persistence. And I think that one particularly, I think everyone's going to be able to relate to this, is the child who doesn't sleep. A child who is persistent, all those sleep help books, unless they're recognizing temperament as a piece of the child's sleep cycle, they're not going to work. There's all these methods and all these suggestions, but ultimately the persistent child, it's probably not going to work for them. So when it comes to this parent shaming, we feel deeply the, how many of my friends use this book and it worked?
Yes.
Well, it does work for a majority of people, and so I think that that's really important when it comes to that shaming and that judgment, that now that you know temperaments, you know and understand that not every book is going to work for every child. And so no longer in your vocabulary is, well, this should work for you because it worked for me, right?
And I think you're getting at, if I can
Yes.
jump in here, this is why at the Science of Parenting, temperament is a big reason why at the Science of Parenting, we talk about a pluralistic approach.
That's
There's more than one way to raise great kids, because what worked for child A, even within the same family, what worked for child A may not work well for child B. They might have different needs, and it's all right to do things differently. And it's all right if that book didn't work for you. That's why we believe it.
Yes. It is not wrong for you to let your child go outside and play before they finish their spelling words. All right. It is not wrong for you to, let your child have a snack before dinner.
And it's not wrong for you to have your child finish your spelling words before going outside.
Exactly. Exactly. So much. Great question.
And sorry, just to kind of build off that, I was thinking, that's our whole philosophy, is taking the research and having it apply to your reality. Is most research and most of those books we're reading are that middle section, right? So we're looking at what works best for the majority of people, because that's how research goes. But temperament is awesome because we can look at the research and then put it in a context of those extremes of how would that maybe play out in a different situation. So,
and your child's still normal. They're just a different kind of normal than this other kind, right?
Right. They just don't fall in the whatever middle section. Yes. So I think we pulled that off, switching questions at last minute, but I thought that was a really great conversation to have too. So thanks to Barb for throwing that one to me.
Yes. Thank you.
Oh, bye.
All right, we'll catch you. He's like, I'm out. I did it. So that's a little bit about persistence, understanding this trait, what it might look like with our kids on either end of the spectrum or the continuum, and how we can look at our own persistence, like other traits. How do we look at our own and our child's to create a goodness of fit, understanding we've got those strategies tucked in our pocket, finding that and recognizing, understanding what our kids might need.
So thanks for joining us today on the Science of Parenting podcast. Remember, subscribe to our weekly audio podcasts on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. And you can watch us each week on our social media and join us periodically as we take your comments and questions live.
So please come along with us as we tackle the ins and outs, the ups and downs, and the research and reality all around the science of parenting.
The Science of Parenting is a research-based education program hosted by Lori Haynes and Mackenzie Johnson, produced by Mackenzie DeYoung with research and writing by Barbara Dunn Swanson. Send in questions and comments to parenting@iastate.edu and connect with us on Facebook and Twitter. This program is brought to you by Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or accommodation inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/ext.